Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim and Alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In this episode, we're talking about testimony, the epistemology of testimony, knowledge from the say-so of other people. Now, why are we talking about this? Well, it's very important to talk about this concept because in a way, it relates to many other things that we have been talking about in previous episodes and in the future episodes that we're going to talk about. And I want you to really understand this concept because when you use this concept and apply and internalize it, you'll be able to navigate your way through contentions from agnostics and atheists and other peoples from other spiritual traditions. And you'll be able to understand, for example, why we believe in some things and the authenticity of hadith and how it relates to the truthfulness of the Prophet ﷺ and how it relates to even to the miracle of the Quran, the linguistic miracle of the Quran. It relates to many, many different things. It also relates to the concept of scientism. Scientism claims that the only method we should use to form conclusions about reality is the scientific method. But this is actually not true because a lot of things that we know are true is not based on the scientific method, but rather the say-so of other people. So it dismantles that kind of 1960s age-old kind of false view that the only way to form conclusions about things is just the crude scientific method. But there are other sources of knowledge and other ways to truth. So this is why it's very important for you to understand testimony. And I want to start by telling you a story, okay? Once I was invited to somebody's house, and I had to speak to their son. And this person was an apostate. He left the tradition of Islam. So this is what we do. We go and speak to people to articulate or re-articulate a very compassionate, warm case of Islam to the wider society. And by the way, I'm maybe adding a bit of spice to the story because I don't remember too much about it, but it's going to be for educational purposes, okay? So just keep that in mind, okay? So I'm trying to paraphrase as much as possible. So what happened was I spoke to this gentleman and it was about 4 hours conversation. I took my brain out and I squeezed every drop. I mean, there's not much in there, but I squeezed as much as possible. And I told him everything about the intellectual foundations of Islam. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists, that He is one, talking about prophethood, Quran, all of these type of things. And he was clutching at intellectual straws and he said to me, look, the reason I don't believe in Islam is because the Quran says the world is flat. Now, by the way, brothers and sisters, the world is not flat. We know that. And the Quran doesn't say the world is flat, but that was his assumption. At that point, I was tired and bordering angry. So what did I say to him? I said, okay, yeah, I believe the world is flat. You prove to me that the world is round. And he was shocked. He was like, what? You don't believe the world is round? Obviously, he knows I was being rhetorical, but I was being serious with him as well at the same time. I said to him, you prove to me the world is round. So he tried to prove it. So you show me the scientific, observed, physical, empirical evidence for the roundness of the earth. So what did he say? Easy, the science textbooks. Like, that's not empirical. That's the say-so of others. You've believed in authority that says the world is round. Not a proof. Then he said, what about Google Maps? What about pictures? I said again, did you take the picture? No. You have to believe that that's the earth, that that's the world, that it is round, and that those are pictures of the world. How do you know it's a picture of the world? Because someone told you. I don't care if they're a million of the same pictures. The point is, it's still the say-so of others. And then he said, well, you know what? I could go on a plane. If I go in a straight line, I'll end up in the same position, meaning the world is round. But that's not true either. We know that, brothers and sisters and friends, because the earth spins. You may not end up in the same position. And plus, I said to him, have you done that before? No. So then he said, okay, I'm going to go on the highest cliff. I could go on the highest cliff. I could see the curvature of the earth. So that's not proof for the roundness of the earth, is it? Is that proof for the roundness of the earth? No, it may prove it's slightly curved, but it could be a dome. It could be like a semicircle. So where's your proof, sir? He said, oh, the mathematics. And I turned around to him and said, have you done the maths yourself? Do you know the mathematics? No. So at this point, he was changing a few colors. He was changing a few colors, man. Green, blue, yellow, name them. Okay? And then he got very excited. Then he said, okay, I got it. Shadows of the night and the day, the alternation of the night and day. And then I turned to him and said, indeed, in the alternation of the night and day are signs for people who reflect. I gave him the ayah of the Quran. His face was on the floor. He tried to reject the Quran, but the Quran actually rejected his position. He said the Quran says the world is flat, right? But I asked him for physical evidence, and at the end, he gave me a piece of evidence that's actually in the Quran. Now the point here is, even the alternation of night and day doesn't clearly show that the world is round. It's an indicator. But the point of the whole discussion, and the reason I'm giving this example, is because of the fact that a lot of the beliefs that we hold is based on the say-so of other people, brothers and sisters. And this includes the roundness of the earth, the very fact that the world is a sphere. And this is extremely important. And in this light, many epistemologists, those who study belief and knowledge, they have come to this conclusion. Obviously, there's criteria to assess how we gain knowledge from the say-so of others. But the point is, it's an indispensable part of our reality, of our human progress. For example, you have Benjamin McMyler, who's an assistant professor. He provides a summary of testimonial knowledge. He says, here are a few things that I know. I know that the copperhead is the most common venomous snake in the Greater Houston area. I know that Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo. I know that, as I write, the average price for gasoline in the US is $4.10 per gallon. All of these things I know on the basis of what epistemologists call testimony, on the basis of being told of them by another person or groups of persons. Even we have Professor C.A. Cody in his very famous landmark book, Testimony, a Philosophical Discussion. He says something similar. He says, many of us have never seen a baby born, nor have most of us examined the circulation of blood, nor the actual geography of the world, nor any fair sample of the laws of the land, nor have we made the observations that lie behind our knowledge that the lights in the sky are heavenly bodies immensely distant. So from this perspective, brothers and sisters and friends, we see the indispensable nature of the say-so of others. However, there has been a discussion between certain philosophers on whether testimony is something fundamental or is based on something empirical. And this is called the reductionist and the anti-reductionist thesis. For example, Professor C.A. Cody, he had a fundamental view on testimony, meaning that testimony is a source of knowledge and it doesn't need to be justified by other sources of knowledge like observation. Whereas David Hume, the Scottish skeptic, he said, no, actually, yes, we believe in testimony, it's indispensable to our learning, but the reason we believe in say-so of other people is because it's connected to our own observations. But this is quite false, because what does he mean by our observations? He doesn't mean about a single person's observations, because you can't rely on your own observations to form scientific conclusions. It would be impossible. Your knowledge would be very limited and we'll never have the progress of science that we have today. So what he means about our observations is the collective observations of the scientists or authorities or the human beings. But the interesting thing here is Professor C.A. Cody says, well, this is the point. It actually proves that testimony is fundamental. It doesn't require other sources of knowledge to justify it. Because how do we know the collective observations of other people? Do we individually observe them ourselves? Of course not. It's actually based on testimony. We have to believe that other people said that this was their observations to take into account to justify our sources of knowledge or to even think about ways of developing new ideas of medicine and progress and scientific understanding. So the point is, it shows that testimony is fundamental. Because if you say, no, the say-so of others has to always be in line with our observations, well, what do you mean by that? Your personal observations or the collective observations of authorities? You can't say personal observations, otherwise you'll never have any progress. And this is interesting because it reminds me of a debate I had with Professor Lawrence Krauss. And he was very kind of crude empirical. He had a crude empirical understanding of the world. It has to be touch and feel, everything that I do experiments myself. So I asked him the question, do you believe in evolution? He said, yes, of course. And then I said to him, have you done all the observations and experiments yourself? And he replied in the negative. And this was my point. It was to try and expose the fact that you still have to rely on the say-so of other people. So it really shows that testimony here is fundamental. It's a valid source of knowledge. But there has been a big discussion on how we assess whether these testimonial forms of transmission, or whether these testimonies of authorities or the say-so of other people is actually valid. And there's been a big discussion amongst philosophers. For example, you have Professor Keith Lehrer. He basically focuses on trust. And he says that we have to be trustworthy in our assessment of others concerning if they're trustworthy. So he focuses on trust, which is quite interesting. But also you have other people such as Benjamin McMyler. They call the right of deferral. They say, well, it's not just about trust, but it's also about to solve the problem of whether a testimonial transmission is valid. The one hearing the say-so of others, there must be a right for deferral. What does this mean? It means that the audience or the person reading or taking the testimonial knowledge, the say-so of others, they have to basically challenge that authority, maybe asking them questions. What do you mean by this? What other evidence do you have? How do you explain counter testimonies? So coherent answers would build that form of trust and would build the fact that actually this is a valid source of knowledge. And you also have Professor Elizabeth Fricker. She makes a very good point. She says, well, not all human beings can know all types of knowledge. We can't make all the observations in the world. We have to trust the say-so of other people. And that's why she makes a very, very interesting point here when she says, but there are some occasions on which it is rationally differentially to accept another's testimony and irrational to refuse to do so. Is entailed by her background knowledge of her own cognitive and physical nature and limitations, together with her appreciation of how other people are both like and in other respects unlike herself, hence of some occasions better epistemically placed regarding some matter than she is herself. I may rationally regret that I cannot fly, or go for a week without sleep without any loss of performance, or find out for myself everything which I would like to know. But given my cognitive and physical limitations as parametric, there is no room for rational regret about my extended but canny trust in the word of others, and enormous epistemic and consequent other riches to be gained from it. In the English language, he's basically saying that sometimes we just have to trust authorities, and we cannot have knowledge without trusting authorities. So the whole discussion now has just been on testimony that is a valid source of knowledge. And that's something you need to understand for other episodes.